There is a woman in Kanazawa who is 61 years old, and whose hair, by the measurement of an actual photograph taken 20 years apart, is visibly thicker now than it was at 40. Her hairdresser stopped asking what products she uses years ago, because the answer is always the same three things. None of them expensive, none of them marketed anywhere as a hair-thinning solution. She has never used a growth serum, she has never had a scalp treatment at a clinic, she does not take a hair-specific supplement, she has, across the 2 decades that photograph spans, spent almost nothing on her hair beyond a haircut every few months, and the same shampoo she has used since her 30s. And somewhere else right now, someone is standing in a bathroom with a hairbrush in one hand, looking at the amount of hair caught in it with a specific and familiar dread. They have already tried the growth serum with the 8-week promise on the label. They have researched the supplement with the biotin and the collagen peptides and the 5-star reviews. They have considered, seriously, the cost of extensions or a topical treatment prescribed by a dermatologist, and they have not yet found the thing that actually changes what they see in the brush each morning. What if the difference between these two people has almost nothing to do with which hair products either of them can access? And what if it has everything to do with 6 habits that have nothing to do with hair care at all? Habits Japan has practiced as ordinary daily life for generations, long before hair thinning became a category with its own aisle in a pharmacy. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what all 6 are. And habit number 3, the one that costs nothing, that most people have never once connected to their hair, and that a dermatologist will tell you matters more than any serum on the market, is the one people tell me they could not believe they had been overlooking. Stay with me, because the final habit is the reason the other 5 actually reach the follicle. Before the 6 habits, there is a piece of biology worth understanding, because it reframes what hair thinning actually is for most people experiencing it. The hair follicle operates in cycles, a growth phase lasting years, a brief transitional phase, and a resting phase before the hair sheds and a new cycle begins. At any given time, roughly 90% of scalp follicles should be in active growth. When that ratio shifts, when a larger proportion of follicles enter the resting and shedding phase simultaneously, the visible result is what most people experience as thinning. Not fewer follicles, in the majority of non-genetic cases, but a larger proportion of existing follicles that have been pushed prematurely out of their growth phase. This distinction matters enormously for what a person should actually expect to work. A treatment aimed at follicles that no longer exist, the genetic pattern most commonly associated with permanent miniaturization, operates on an entirely different biological problem than a treatment aimed at follicles that are simply cycling out of growth phase prematurely due to a correctable physiological stressor. Much of the confusion and disappointment people experience with hair products stems from applying a solution suited to one category of thinning to a problem that actually belongs to the other, without ever having the distinction explained to them at the point of purchase. Dr. Elise Olsen, a dermatologist whose research on hair loss has been widely cited, has documented that this premature shift is frequently triggered not by any single dramatic event, but by a cluster of chronic, low-grade physiological stressors: nutritional deficiency, chronic inflammation, hormonal disruption, and cortisol elevation, among the most significant, operating over months, often without the person experiencing them recognizing a connection to their scalp at all. The follicle, in other words, is often one of the last places the body chooses to protect when its broader resources are under sustained strain, precisely because hair, unlike organ function, is not immediately necessary for survival. 6 habits. Here is what they are. The first habit extends the food philosophy this series has documented for the brain, for longevity, and for skin, into the specific building blocks a follicle requires to remain in its growth phase. Hair is composed almost entirely of keratin, a protein, and the follicle's capacity to produce it depends directly on adequate protein intake and the specific micronutrients, iron, zinc, and biotin among the most researched, that support keratin synthesis. When dietary protein or these micronutrients are insufficient, the body applies a specific triage. Hair, along with nails and certain other non-essential tissues, is among the first systems to have its resources rationed, since neither survival nor immediate function depends on it the way organ tissue does. This is precisely why hair thinning is frequently among the earliest visible signs of a nutritional gap that has not yet produced any other symptom the person would notice. Research published in the International Journal of Trichology has found that iron deficiency, even at subclinical levels that would not register as anemia on a standard blood panel, is significantly associated with increased hair shedding, particularly in women, and that correcting iron status is one of the most reliably effective interventions for non-genetic hair thinning that the research has identified. Ferritin, the protein that stores iron in the body, has been specifically identified as a marker worth monitoring, since ferritin levels considered normal by general medical standards have, in several studies, still been found too low to support optimal keratin production at the follicle. The traditional Japanese diet provides these building blocks with unusual consistency. Fish delivers complete protein alongside the omega-3 fatty acids this series has already connected to reduce systemic inflammation. And inflammation, when chronic, is among the physiological stressors Dr. Olsen's research links directly to premature follicle shedding. Seaweed, nori, wakame, kombu, is unusually rich in iron and zinc relative to its caloric content, and is consumed in Japan at a volume and frequency almost entirely absent from the standard Western diet. Fermented soy products, tofu and natto among them, provide additional complete protein without the saturated fat load of some Western protein sources. She eats what this entire series has already documented her eating: fish, fermented soy, seaweed in her miso soup several times a week. None of it was chosen for her hair. The follicle, requiring protein and iron to remain in growth phase, has simply been receiving what it needed for decades, without her framing a single meal as a hair care decision. The second habit is a small, specific physical practice most Western hair routines skip entirely, in favor of products applied on top of the same underlying circulation problem. The follicle receives its nutrient supply through a dense network of capillaries at the scalp, and the health of that supply line, its microcirculation, has a direct, measurable relationship to how effectively nutrients and oxygen reach the follicle during its growth phase. A follicle sitting above a poorly perfused patch of scalp is, in effect, being asked to build keratin from a diet delivered through a narrowed pipe, regardless of how much protein and iron the person eating that diet is actually consuming. Research published in the journal Dermatologic Therapy has found that scalp massage, performed consistently over months, produces measurable increases in hair thickness, attributed specifically to improved microcirculation and mechanical stimulation of the follicle. Japanese hair washing traditionally incorporates this mechanical stimulation directly into the washing process itself, rather than treating massage as a separate practice requiring dedicated time. The scalp is massaged with the fingertips during shampooing, rather than the hair simply being lathered and rinsed, and the final rinse is frequently done at a cooler temperature than the wash itself, a practice with a specific circulatory rationale. Cold water exposure produces a brief vasoconstriction, followed by a rebound vasodilation once the scalp returns to normal temperature. A pattern research on cold exposure and circulation has associated with improved blood flow to the treated area over repeated exposure, similar to the mechanism behind cold water therapies used elsewhere in the body. The two practices work together, rather than separately. The massage physically increases blood flow in the moment, while the cold rinse rebound effect extends a version of that increase for a period afterward, meaning the follicle receives an elevated nutrient supply during and immediately after the exact window when it is also being cleaned and, potentially, mildly stressed by the washing process itself. She massages her scalp for the full duration of washing her hair and finishes with a cooler rinse, not as a hair-thinning intervention, but because it is simply how washing hair has always been done in the home she grew up in. This is the habit I told you about at the beginning. The one that costs nothing, that most people have never connected to their hair, and that a dermatologist will tell you matters more than any serum currently on the market. Here is the mechanism. Sebum, the natural oil produced at the scalp, is not simply a cosmetic nuisance to be stripped away with frequent washing. It coats and protects the hair shaft, and its even distribution from root to tip has a direct relationship to hair's resistance to breakage, its capacity to retain moisture, and the visible health of its cuticle, the outer protective layer of each strand. Left undistributed, sebum accumulates at the scalp, where it contributes to buildup and, some research suggests, to a localized inflammatory environment around the follicle opening. Distributed evenly along the length of the hair, That same sebum functions as a natural conditioner, requiring no additional product. The tsuge comb, traditionally carved from a single piece of boxwood, used in Japan for centuries, is specifically designed for this purpose. Wide, evenly spaced teeth that move sebum down the length of the hair shaft, with minimal static and minimal mechanical stress on the hair itself. Unlike plastic combs and brushes, which generate static that roughens the cuticle with repeated use and can contribute to breakage over time. Dr. Amy McMichael, a dermatologist whose research has focused extensively on hair and scalp health, has noted that the mechanical damage from harsh brushing, pulling, snapping, and cuticle roughening from repeated friction is an underappreciated contributor to hair that appears thin, distinct from and often compounding any actual reduction in follicle activity. A person can be losing no more hair than is biologically normal and still see visibly thinner-looking hair, because what remains has been mechanically damaged into breakage, split ends, and a roughened cuticle that reflects light poorly and tangles more easily. She combs her hair slowly, from the ends first working upward, to avoid unnecessary pulling, redistributing the scalp's own oil the entire length of the strand. The comb is decades old. It was never marketed as a hair-thinning solution. It simply does, mechanically, what a bottle of leave-in conditioner is sold to approximate. The fourth habit connects to the sleep research this series has covered extensively, applied here to the specific mechanism by which sleep affects the follicle directly. Hair follicle stem cells, research has found, follow a circadian rhythm of their own, with DNA repair and cellular division activity concentrated during specific windows of the sleep cycle. The same deep sleep phases this series has already connected to skin cell regeneration and cognitive consolidation. This is a relatively recent finding in the hair research literature, and one that reframes the follicle less as a passive structure quietly growing hair in the background, and more as a tissue with its own internal clock, actively coordinating its repair and division activity around the same daily rhythm that governs sleep, cortisol, and body temperature throughout the rest of the body. A study published in the journal PLOS Biology, examining circadian regulation in hair follicle stem cells, found that disruption to normal sleep-wake cycles measurably impaired the DNA repair capacity of these cells, leaving them more vulnerable to the accumulated cellular damage associated with premature follicle aging and shedding. The impairment was specific to the timing of the disruption, rather than simply the total hours of sleep lost, suggesting that irregular sleep, going to bed at markedly different times across a week, for instance, may carry a distinct cost to follicle repair beyond what sleep duration alone would predict. Growth hormone, released in its largest nightly pulse during deep sleep and already discussed in this series for its role in skin collagen production, performs an analogous function at the follicle, signaling tissue repair and supporting the metabolic activity the follicle requires to remain in active growth phase, rather than being pushed prematurely into the resting phase. Dr. Olsen's research associates with chronic physiological stress. Cortisol, elevated by insufficient or fragmented sleep, is independently documented as one of the most consistent triggers of the premature shift from growth to resting phase across the hair loss research this video has already cited. A person can be eating well, washing correctly, and combing gently, and still see the benefit of those three habits partially undone by chronic sleep deprivation, working through the same stress pathway this series has connected to brain aging, skin aging, and cellular aging throughout. Her 7 to 8 hours of sleep, discussed elsewhere in this series for entirely different reasons, has been supporting her follicle's own repair cycle the entire time. The fifth habit is one this series has returned to repeatedly, for burnout, for immune function, for aging, for skin. Here it appears again for the specific way it affects the scalp, which none of those previous contexts addressed. The heat exposure of the ofuro produces a full body increase in circulation, and the scalp, richly supplied with blood vessels relative to its surface area, receives a proportionally significant share of that increase. Combined with the heat shock proteins this series has discussed in the aging and skin videos, the ofuro appears to support follicle-adjacent tissue repair through the same cellular quality control mechanism operating throughout the rest of the body, including the keratinocytes and dermal papilla cells directly responsible for hair growth. The dermal papilla in particular functions as a kind of command center for the follicle, signaling the surrounding cells to remain in growth phase or shift toward resting phase depending on the nutrient and hormonal environment it detects. and that environment is directly influenced by how well blood is reaching it. There is a second, less obvious benefit specific to the scalp. Heat and steam open and soften the pores at the base of each follicle, allowing any accumulated sebum or product buildup to be more effectively cleared during the subsequent wash. Meaning the scalp environment the follicle occupies stays cleaner, with less aggressive product intervention than a scalp that is never exposed to sustained heat before washing. A scalp that relies on harsh clarifying shampoos to remove the same buildup that heat and steam would have loosened gently is trading one form of stress on the follicle for another, since the surfactants in stronger cleansing products can themselves disrupt the same delicate follicle environment the wash was meant to protect. She takes the Ofuro every evening, the water at the same temperature it has always been, the routine unchanged for as long as she can remember. Her hair, and the scalp beneath it, has simply been receiving a nightly circulation and repair cycle that was never once framed, by her, as a hair treatment. The sixth habit is the one that ties all 5 of the others together, because chronic stress can override the benefit of every one of them simultaneously. Telogen effluvium, the clinical term for the specific pattern of diffuse hair shedding triggered by physiological or psychological stress, is one of the most well-documented stress-hair connections in dermatological research, typically appearing 2 to 3 months after a significant stressor as the follicles that were prematurely pushed into resting phase finally shed. Dr. Olsen's research, cited earlier in this video, identifies chronic cortisol elevation as one of the most consistent triggers across the causes of non-genetic hair thinning the research has cataloged, meaning a person doing everything else correctly can still see diffuse shedding driven primarily by unmanaged chronic stress, independent of diet, washing technique, or sleep quality in isolation. The mechanism runs through the hair follicle's own stress response system. Follicles contain their own local corticotropin-releasing hormone receptors, meaning they respond directly to circulating stress hormones rather than only through indirect nutritional or circulatory pathways. Chronic elevation of these hormones has been shown, in research on the hair follicle's neuroendocrine system, to directly suppress the signaling pathways that keep a follicle in active growth phase, a mechanism entirely separate from, and additive to, any nutritional or circulatory factor the first 5 habits address. The practices this series has documented under Seijaku and Ma are not typically framed as hair care. They function as one anyway, by keeping the cortisol environment in which the previous 5 habits operate stable enough for those habits to reach the follicle, rather than being quietly undone by a stress response the follicle is directly wired to detect. She has never described her tea, her walks, her unhurried evenings as part of a hair routine. Dermatologically, they may be the most important part of it. 6 habits, none of them sold as a hair thinning solution. All of them quietly supporting the follicle longer, and more effectively, than most of what occupies a pharmacy's hair care aisle. Shokuiku for the follicle, the protein, iron, and zinc that keratin synthesis actually requires, arriving through an ordinary diet rather than a supplement capsule. The cold rinse and scalp massage, supporting the microcirculation the follicle depends on for its nutrient supply. The tsuge comb, distributing the scalp's own sebum the length of the strand, and avoiding the mechanical damage that makes existing hair look thinner than it biologically is. 7 to 8 hours of sleep, during which hair follicle stem cells perform the DNA repair research, has directly linked to premature follicle aging when disrupted. The Ofuro, supporting scalp circulation and follicle-adjacent cellular repair through the same heat shock mechanism this series has documented for skin and longevity. And Seijaku, the stress management that keeps cortisol from directly suppressing the follicle's own growth signaling, regardless of how correctly the other 5 habits are practiced. She is 61, her hair is thicker than it was at 40. The reason was never in a bottle. It was 6 ordinary habits, practiced for decades, that she has never once described to anyone as a hair care routine. Tonight, before you go to bed, pick one habit from this list that has nothing to do with a product. The sleep, the stress, the way you comb tomorrow morning. Begin there. If this changed the way you think about your own hair, share it with someone who has been buying serum after serum and watching the same amount of hair collect in the brush regardless. The answer may not be in the next bottle. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.